I'm going to give you a little rundown on pellets and ground bait today. Just a little user-friendly guide, just to when to use them, why you would use them, and what's actually in the ground baits themselves. So you'll see here, I've got 3 ground baits that pretty much cover most of my fishing. Now, starting off with the actual summer mix, if you like, a little bit more potency in this one. We've actually got a couple of new ground baits coming. They're exactly the same, so it's the bagger mix. It's a little bit more of a higher oil pellet ground bait, but we've also now gone and done it in green and dark. Now, when it comes to colour, I think that all depends on the venue. So the green, for me, when I'm fishing with like ground bait and dead reds in the margin, I like to use a green ground bait in contrast with red hook baits. I feel like that works really, really well. I've had a lot of success in the past using that, rather than fishing red hook baits over, say, a normal coloured brown standard ground bait. So bagger is probably my go-to summer mix. It's the one that I can do a bit of everything with. I can fish it on a feeder if I mix it dry, I can fish it on the pole, I can slop it up, I can do loads with that ground bait. But it's got high oil pellets in, which means it's a little bit heavier, it's a little bit stickier, really, really user friendly. The next mix that I want to talk to you about is F1 Dark. Now F1 Dark is a lot milder, so in terms of actual ground baits, if you think of these as bagger being a little bit more high oil, a little bit more potency to it, F1 Dark being a little bit milder, sort of like in the medium sort of range if you like, and then your pure crushed expander being like the milder side. So the further we go up here, we've got mild, medium and strong if you like. That's a good guide to sort of like what sort of consistency and what sort of strength you want your ground bait, because in winter months you want your ground bait to be a little bit non-offensive and quite mild. That's where pure crushed expander is brilliant, but in the summer it might not have enough pulling power and it's a little bit light and fluffy. Therefore you want to steer more towards the bagger mix, which you can make a little bit heavier, it's got a little bit more potency to it, it's got more pulling power. So F1 Dark, when would I use that? That has got lots of great sweeteners and sugars in it. It's really good for like your skimmers and your F1 fishing in the winter months when you want something a little bit sweeter but not too overpowering. Now, if I go into the real depths of winter, what I like to use then is a 50-50 mix of both these ground baits. The reason for that is the expander will make it a little bit lighter, a little bit fluffier, which when you're fishing for soft mouth fish like skimmers, they really like a soft ground bait. You don't want something with any big bits in and stuff like that. So when you're wetting it up, make sure you push it through a fine fine riddle, not a sieve, but like a pinky riddle, just to get any bigger lumps out, make your ground bait nice and soft and fluffy. It clouds up better and the fish love that, skimmers in particular. And that's when I'll probably use my F1 Dark the most. If I want to fish, say, an F1 style venue and I just want to feed little thumbnails of it, then again I can use it in a 50-50 mix if it's really, really cold. But on days like today where it is cold but the water temperature's rising slightly, we're not in the depths of winter, I can just use F1 Dark on its own. And then when would I use pure crushed expander? Now, we've also got a dark version of this coming out. If the water's really clear, I always feel like dark is great. Dark, clear water just matches perfectly. You know, when you look at fish, they've got a dark back to them, which means that they blend into their habitats. They feel safer when they're actually feeding over a darker bottom. If the water's really coloured, what you'll notice is fish like roach and perch, in commercials especially, they'll almost be a lot lighter in colour, and that's because the water's more coloured and they adapt to it. So therefore, sometimes when the water's a tidgy bit more coloured, most standard commercials will have a little bit more colour in than, say, a natural venue, and that's when just your plain brown pure crushed expander is brilliant, because the fish will see that cloud on the bottom. It's a little bit more something to home in on, if you like, whereas dark can blend in a little bit more. It's not as obtrusive to the fish, they don't feel as scared. But it can work the opposite. When you want to attract fish, sometimes a light pellet-based ground bait is brilliant. And again, it all comes back to contrast of hook baits. If I'm fishing with this, I'm generally fishing with 2mm micro pellets as well, and maybe a 4mm expander on the hook. And I always find that a natural colour with a 4mm expander works best. If I'm feeding dark ground baits, sometimes a 4mm expander doesn't seem to have the same effect. So for that reason, sometimes just fishing a normal natural plain colour is better. So colour wise, I can't tell you what's best, but as a guide, when the water is clearer, you generally go a little bit darker. When the water is a little bit more coloured, you can go a little bit lighter. So for that example, Bagger Mix in the summer, it's a light colour. Green works really well because of the contrast, so green can be quite good. It's not too dark green, it's not too light of a green, it's just a perfect colour. And if you mix it on the dry side, when you're fishing it on a feeder, ground bait and dead reds can be a brilliant concoction. So that's a little guide to ground baits. Think about how mild you want your ground bait. You know, when it's really cold, go a little bit milder, use the pure crushed expander, very low in oil, hardly any oil whatsoever, and that's the reason why it fluffs up really nice. F1 dark, if you want that sweetness for skimmers and F1s when the water's a little bit colder, that's a great mixture. And then if you want that little bit more potency, Bagger Mix is brilliant for that in the summer months. Any time when the water's sort of above 10 degrees, springs, autumn, summer, I feel like Bagger Mix then comes into its own. Moving on to pellet choice, I try and keep it very simple. We've got 2, 4, 6 and 8 mils in the range, but we have different varieties of pellets. So we have low oil pellets, which is the SK range, and we also have higher oil pellets, which is the Cell and the Activate. Now the Activate's very meaty. I pretty much only ever use that in the summer, to be fair, but my go-to hard pellet, so starting with the bigger pellets, my go-to hard pellet is Cell. It's got a nice sweetness to it, it's got the Cell additive already infused into the pellet. I love the smell of it, and they're very, very uniform and brilliant to use. So whenever it comes to carp fishing, I always like that higher oil, because it doesn't break down as quickly. They're very uniform in size, which means grouping of your pellets is really good because they all fire consistently. They make more noise because they're higher in oil, which again, carp love noise in the summer months. So whenever I'm carp fishing, 4, 6 and 8 mils in the Cell range is my go-to. Now, don't get caught out if it's fishery pellets, do not be using these pellets. Make sure you use fishery pellets where you can. But where places like today, Bradshaw Oil Fisheries, it's any pellets, you could pretty much come here and use what you want. And that's when you can see the benefits of using different styles of pellets. Skretting pellets, for me, SK2 pellets, basically, the lower oil, they don't have as much noise to them, but what they are brilliant for is the low feed, low oil. So they break down a little bit quicker than, say, a Cell or an Activate pellet, which is great if you're fishing in the colder months or you're fishing for F1s and skimmers where you want a low feed pellet. You don't want the fish to be getting filled up by higher oil pellets. So moving down the range, when would I use a 4 mil skretting pellet? Like I said, if it's carp fishing, I'd use a higher oil Cell pellet. But when I move down and I'm fishing for F1s and skimmers in particular, I like to use a 4 mil skretting pellet. So the SK4s are perfect for that. Low oil, they break down and they're not going to fill the fish up as much. They almost break down into a ground bait over time once they've been in the water for a while. Same goes with the micro pellets. You'll find an SK pellet or a Skrettings pellet will break down and it will bind better around a feeder than, say, a Cell 2 mil or an Activate 2 mil. The reason for this is the low oil is less stickiness. When it's higher oil, it tends to be stickier. Now, if you're chucking and leaving your feeder out for a long period, you can still fish the Cell 2 mils, and what they'll do is they'll stay and bind around the feeder brilliant. So they're great for deep water, they're great for long period casting. So if you're casting up to, say, 30, 40 minutes, even an hour at times in the winter, you can always mix a ratio of the two pellets. So you could have 80% Skrettings and 20% of the higher oil Cell pellets or Activate pellets. But when it comes to like F1 fishing, my go-to pellet for 99% of my fishing is the SK2, and if I'm fishing for F1s and skimmers, I'll use the SK4s, and all my other carp fishing, I use 4, 6 and 8 mils in the Cell range. So feeding for me is the most important thing. I've spoke about the potency of ground baits and pellets. You know, you've got to pick the right bait to start with. If you're using the wrong bait, i.e. if it's too strong, it's going to put the fish off. Just like me and you, you're not going to eat something that you don't like the smell or taste of. Likewise, if it's not strong enough in the summer months when the water's coloured, you're not going to get maximum attraction. The next biggest thing that people always want to know is how much to actually feed. So, starting off with micro pellets, I've got the small guru pot here, and this is probably the most negative way you can feed pellets, and that's by filling your pot up, having your little sprinkle lid on, and what this does is as you're feeding your pellets, you're creating a column of micro pellets falling through the water, and what happens then is that the fish are allowed to see the bait falling. you create a bigger column, which in turn is more attractive to the fish. Rather than your bait just going down in one big heap, that's not going to be really attractive to the fish. So by sprinkling your pellets when the fishing's really, really hard, almost rock bottom, is a great way of attracting fish into your peg. Now, as the fishing picks up, you're going into the spring months, you're still going to be using micro pellets. You can use micro pellets pretty much all year round. They're a great attractor. They're a bait that the fish will eat from, you know, a 2-ounce roach, 2-ounce skimmer, all the way up to a 20-pound carp. It's not a bait that's sort of like selective. It's brilliant. It's my go-to margin bait, if you like. So when we come to the springtime, we just need to feed a few more of them. And that's where, again, it's a small, fast release pot, holds a little bit more than when you're sprinkling, and all I'll do with that then is I'll clump the bait in. And what I mean by clump the bait in is it releases in one go. And you might think, well, you just told me not to do that. You told me to sprinkle the bait. That's great for attracting fish into your peg. But once the fish are actually feeding in your peg, if you start putting a column through like this, that's when you tend to get foul lookers. As the bait's falling through, the fish start rising and looking up for it, because as you're doing that, you're creating noise, and this column of bait falling through, the fish naturally are going to look up because they're inquisitive. So what you want to do then is get your pole pot, and with these fast release, as you put your pole pot on the water, it will basically release the pellets. So if I put that onto the water there, for example, as it gets level with the water, your pellets will touch the water and they release out your pot. And what that does is it sends your pellets down to the bottom, there's no noise, and they go down in one column. And this in return stops any liners, stops foul lookers, or eliminates liners and foul lookers. Sometimes if there's too many fish in your peg, you have to feed a little bit less because there's too many there. So that amount of bait is great for sort of spring and autumn. As you're going through the summer months, you're going to stick with the same principle of using a fast release pot, because again, we don't want to be sprinkling bait in the summer. We can use noise to our advantage when we're using bigger pellets, but in micro pellets, the attraction is that the bait falls that little bit slower and it creates a column, and the fish love that. So moving into the summer months, if I was fishing for F1s, this is about the maximum that I would probably feed every go in. Any more than this, and I feel like you're probably going to have too many particles in your peg. So that sort of volume of bait, a medium sort of size pot, is a great way to feed in the summer. If you're fishing in really shallow water though, you generally catch bigger fish. So big F1s and carp, that's when your large and your extra large pots come into play. Now my extra large, I would only ever use that for carp fishing. It's very rare that I would use that for F1 fishing, because it's way too much bait for a 1 to 3 pound F1. You just don't need it. But if you're fishing for 8-10 pound fish and you're fishing in the margins with like micros and any hook bait over the top, whether it be maggots, corn, worms, big hook baits, that's a great alternative and a great way to feed your peg. You can feed it with ground bait, which we'll come on to a little bit more. The large pot is sort of in between. If I'm catching a mixture of carp and F1s, the medium might not be enough bait to hold the fish. So in the summer months, the medium's great for F1s if you're feeding it every single chuck in, but sometimes you need that little bit extra, because an odd carp will come in and they'll eat a lot of your bait very quickly. They're a lot more aggressive than F1s are, and that's where my large pot will come in. So again, if I'm fishing in the margins, across to a far bank in shallow water, anything like 2 foot and less, that sort of volume of bait is a great sort of starting point and a great guide. If you're not getting bites, then sometimes you need to attract the fish, so try up in your pot. If you're getting too many fish in your peg, then you don't need to feed them because they're already there. So sometimes try cutting it back, and that'll stop any foulers and foul lookers, any sort of like liners, fish wafting your bait about. Just try and control your peg by alternating your feed. So there's a few different options there. Moving on to the actual 4 mils. Now 4 mils can be loose fed, they can be catapulted. They're 2 great ways of attracting fish into your peg. But you'll have days where you're loose feeding pellets and your peg starts to slow down, and the reason for that is your pellets spread over a much wider area. It takes longer for the fish to actually pick them up. Now what that means is that you're going to wait longer for a bite. It's going to take longer for the fish to find your actual hook bait. So if you're ever having to actually feed 4 mils, if you wanted to soak them, all I do is basically cover them in water for the size of the pellet. So 4 mils 4 minutes, 6 mils 6 minutes, but most of the time I'll feed these dry, or I'll flash dunk them. And what I mean by flash dunk them is I take the amount I want to feed. A medium sized pot is always a good starting point in the summer months. don't tend to use these too much in the winter. I tend to only use micro pellets, but if I'm skimmer fishing, I would soak these for 4 minutes, let them soak all the way through the pellet. Generally do it the night before or in the morning, so you've got plenty of time to soak through, because they generally take about an hour to fully expand and take on the water. And I could be loose feeding an odd one of them for skimmers in like the springtime if the fishing's really good and I was fishing, say, silverfish matches. Sometimes you go to deep venues like here today at Bradshaw's, it's 9 foot deep. I've had a lot of success with soaked 4mm pellets, loose feeding them and catching bigger stamp skimmers, whereas micro pellets, great in the really cold months, but they tend to attract a smaller fish. So I can use a combination of both. I could feed a little ball of micros and loose feed some 4mm pellets, and that can be a great tactic for skimmers. But if I'm fishing for F1s, then what I would like to do is fill my pot up with my required amount. So I've probably got 50 pellets in that medium pole pot, and I'm just going to put that there. 50 pellets in that medium pole pot, and I would flash dunk them. And what I mean by that, I'd have my pole pot on the end of my actual my top kit. I'd dunk them under the water, and with these pots they've got little slits in the side, and as I dunk it, the water, you'll see, will drain through. What that means is that the dry pellets now are sort of clagged up in the pot. They're not going to bounce out on the way out, and then when I get there and I turn them over and tap them in, all the pellets are pre-soaked and they'll basically sink, they'll get through the water surface. If I loose fed them dry, sometimes you get an odd flow that just doesn't go through the water surface tension. So by flash soaking them, dunking them or tapping them out of your pole pot, it just gets them straight down to the bottom. It takes that little, it sort of degreases them, if you like. So that's one way of feeding pellets if you're fishing with a pole pot. The other way is to put them in like a bait strainer, give them literally one big dunk, let them sort of degrease and get the water off them, and then they're available to loose feed. If you're fishing for skimmers, pre-soak them, 4 minutes for 4mm, etc. The size of the pellet is generally how long I'd soak them as a guide. They'll soften through within about an hour, and you've also got then a 4mm pellet which you can have nice and soft and loose feed for like skimmers, F1s in the winter months. Moving on to 6mm. Now if I'm fishing with 6mm, I'm generally going to be fishing with the cell range. I'm generally fishing for carp. They're a little bit too big for sort of like F1s and skimmers and other fish like that. So I'm being a little bit more selective with this style of pellet. And I've always found the best way to feed these, again, you can do exactly the same thing. So I could pot a few in, I could put them in a pole pot, give them a little flash dunk, exactly the same. The water drains off the pot. When I get there, I tap them in. But because these are a heavier pellet and they're more high oil, the best way to feed them is generally with a catapult. So in terms of a volume, if the fishing's not brilliant or it's coming out of winter, say springtime, sometimes just feeding 5 or 6 pellets is enough. You know, sometimes even 3 or 4 pellets is enough to catch, because what you're relying on with this is as you're loose feeding them, they're basically making that noise, that little plop, 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 and that's what's attractive to the fish. Fish love noise in the summer months, or when it's warmer, when you're generally using, excuse me, or when you're generally using bigger, harder pellets, noise is the key. If I was feeding and the fishing was really good, or I was going to a deeper venue, then I'd have to feed a greater volume, in which case I might fire in half a pouch full, or even 3/4 of a pouch full. Sometimes that equates roughly to about 15 pellets. Sometimes feeding once is not the best option, because if I have a misfire, all my pellets might drop short, they might go longer. So what I always like to do is I think to myself, how many pellets do I think I want to feed? Let's say I want to feed 30 pellets. I would rather put 15 in my pouch twice like that, so 2 half pouches, and feed it twice. The reason for this is it gives you more noise. You've got 2 lots of attraction there all of a sudden. You've got 2 lots of pellets hitting the water twice. I always think when you feed twice, the first one is like a dinner bell. If I heard a rustle, for example, behind me in the grass, I would think, what was that? When I hear that second rustle, I can home in on that spot and I know exactly where to go to find that bait. So feeding twice to me is a much better option rather than feeding once. The time when feeding once can work is when the fish are starting to come off the bottom and you want to keep them down on the bottom. So 1 big pouch full, just to make sure that there's not too many columns of bait falling through the water, which in turn might bring them off the bottom a couple of foot. So on deep venues, 1 big pouch full when you've hooked a fish can be a great way of resettling them for your next chuck. So once or twice, very rare I feed 3 times. I only ever feed 3 times if I have a total misfire. So if I misfire and it's a metre short, you've got to remember that you've got to have bait around your hook bait to actually get a bite. So your loose offerings, if they drop short, the fish are going to come to that. So sometimes you may see me, I might feed a third time. It's generally because I've had a bad catapult. But 4, 6 and 8 mils in the cell range when I'm carp fishing, normally catapult is the king. When it comes to volumes of bait, how much to feed, ground bait is a little bit different to micro pellets. Micro pellets are what I would class as a particle. They fill the fish up a little bit more. With ground bait, they're not as filling, but they are very, very attractive. So you get a lot more fish into your peg with a lot less feed content, which means when you come to feeding them, you have to feed that little bit more. So everything I said about micro pellets, if you take that and you go up a pot size, you're never going to be a million miles away. So, for example, I'm going to start the most negative way. There's 2 ways I could feed this. If it's a really shallow venue and I was fishing for silverfish, say, little tiny skimmers, you don't want to feed a lot of bait. You're going to fill them fish up very quickly. A 4 or 5 ounce skimmer has not got a big appetite. If you feed too much bait, you can actually kill your peg quite quickly. So there's 2 ways I always feel of feeding ground bait. You can feel it what I call stodgy, where it's over wetted and it's a little bit like jelly, or you can feed it the standard way, which is just mixed, a little bit of water, push through a riddle, and it's nice and fluffy. Now, if you was fishing it on a feeder, feed it a little bit on the drier side, mix it, on the little bit more drier side. What that does is allows it to break off the feeder. Now when it comes to actual ground bait choice for the feeder, try and stay away from crushed expander, because round a method and a hybrid feeder, it's not got no binding properties. The bagger mix I can pretty much use throughout the summer months, and I can fish it round a feeder. It's got a bit of high oil pellets in there, which means that it binds a lot better than something like a low oil pellet, like an expander that's got no binding power whatsoever. It'll just basically, you'll struggle to get it around the feeder and stay on. So moving on to actually pole fishing, if I feed a little tiny small guru, it will take next to nothing. When I put that in the water and it goes down, you can imagine that's going to disintegrate into absolutely nothing. You're going to have very, very odd speckles on the bottom. Sometimes feeding that when you're fishing really shallow venues for small little palm-sized skimmers can be brilliant. If I'm fishing for F1s, it's probably not quite enough, and that's where I feel like the small guru is a little bit better option, the fast release. It holds that little bit extra volume of bait, so when that comes out, it's just probably double the amount. Even though they're both small pots, this one has got a much wider base to it, the fast release. It holds a slightly little bit more ground bait than your standard small guru. So when it comes to loose ground bait, I would probably say the fast release is the better option. What this pot is great for though, is when I'm feeding little tiny marbles of stodge, and what I like to do is roll it in my hand, and it'll almost be like jelly, and it'll form a little ball, probably the size of my thumbnail, and I can just drop that in that little pot. And because it's a little bit deeper and not as shallow as the fast release, I can just smidge it into the pot and that'll just hold. So when I get out there, I can get to where I want to go, a little tap of the pot and that little ball of stodge will come out. That's a great way for fishing for skimmers when you want to feed next to nothing. Now, if I was fishing in deeper water and I wanted to get my bait down, I wanted to break down slowly, again, what I could do with a stodge is I could feed it very overwetted. So this is very overwetted, almost getting it like paste type texture, a soft paste texture. What this is going to do, because it's already really wetted and it can't take on much more water before it goes to a slop, it's going to take a lot longer to break down. And if you've got a very odd particle in there, so say you're skimmer fishing, you've got a very odd dead maggot or a dead pinky, a few micro pellets, the fish have got to work at this little ball of stodge to get your ground bait, to get your particles out of there. So it's going to keep them in your peg for a little bit longer. It's not going to attract any small tiny roach and stuff because there's nothing loose coming off it. So it's a great way of attracting bigger stamp fish and also making the fish work for your bait. Now, if you wanted a bit more of an impact and a faster response, just feeding a little nugget of the drier stuff, or what I would call like your medium consistency, just your normal wetted down ground bait, it opens up a lot quicker and everything's a little bit more accessible to the fish. So if you was topping up regular, this can be a great way of feeding your ground bait. Again, if I was fishing for skimmers and I was catching slightly better stamp and I wanted to sort of fish and catch 5, 6, 7 fish off a ball of ground bait, sometimes feeding a little bit more is better than feeding a tiny little thumbnail of it, because it's going to last longer in your peg. You're not putting bait through the water regular where the skimmers might back off when there's bait falling on top of their heads. So when you're fishing for tiny, smaller skimmers, little tiny amounts is great. Slightly better stamp, or you're looking for bigger runs of fish, you feed that little bit more. Now, moving on to F1 fishing, coming into the spring months, feeding little nuggets is not going to be good enough. It's not going to be enough bait. What I like to do, if I'm fishing in shallow water, I generally only use ground bait for F1s when I'm fishing in sort of 2.5 foot and less. Anything sort of deeper than 2.5 foot, the F1s tend to come off the bottom because you're going to be feeding regular. It's going to lead to foul hookers and liners. That's when you'd sort of steer more towards micro pellets. But what I do like to do is feed ground bait in shallow water when I'm fishing for F1s and carp, i.e. margins, mudline fishing, things like that. Brilliant way of attracting the fish in because you've got loads and loads of attraction. So I don't really use stodge for that. I just use normal wetted ground bait. Now, if you want to get your ground bait really, really wet, mix it in a way that you can basically add a little bit of water until you can get it as heavy as you possibly can. I always like to start by just mixing it sort of that sort of ratio. That's sort of like 2 parts ground bait, 1 part water. So whatever you're using ground bait, half it with water, and that'll get you to that sort of stage roughly. And then if I want to add a little bit more, I just solely dribble a bit of water in, riddle it through, push it through the riddle. When it struggles to go through the riddle, that's when you know it won't take any more water on. So you just leave it sort of 10-20 minutes, push it through the riddle, and that's about as damp as you can get your ground bait. And then what I like to do is introduce it via a pole pot loose. So I'll push it into my pole pot. The fast release is the best pot for this. Your bait will basically come out, it'll go down, it'll break up as it's going down, and that cloud is what attracts the fish. This is why it's so good in shallow water, but not as effective in deep water. When you're feeding ground bait in loose and deeper water, you tend to lead to foul hookers, your bait will disintegrate to nothing. It works best, me personally, I find 2.5 foot and less. Probably 2 foot and less is when it's at its actual best. And you've got to think about how much to feed. So springtime, you know, the medium fast release is a perfect amount just to get a bite when the fishing's a little bit trickier. Most of the time though, ground bait is associated with summer fishing. You're fishing in really shallow water, sometimes as shallow as 10 inches. The fish can come into that really shallow water, and particles are not as effective. Ground bait then really comes into its own. The fish come into the cloud, they have a look at the bait, there's not much there for them to eat, and hopefully your hook bait gets picked up. Now, when I'm feeding and I'm fishing for F1s, I always find the large is a great amount. Again, medium's a great amount for F1s with pellets, but when you fish with ground bait, you want to sort of step up a size because there's not as much food content in this. There's nothing for the fish to really eat. So you always feed in a pot size more than what you would when you're fishing with particles. But if I'm carp fishing, pretty much the only pot I use now when I come to the summer months and I'm carp fishing for big carp is either my big large pot, which I like to feed in volumes to get them there, but if I'm fishing on snake lakes or margin fishing, the fish are coming in regular, the XL pot is a brilliant amount of bait. It's probably around about 50 mil of ground bait, and that is enough to catch a fish and feed that amount every single chuck. And that's a brilliant way of going across. If you're fishing on a mudline, if you're fishing in your margin, that amount of ground bait, when you're feeding it regular every couple of minutes in the summer, you won't build your bait up too much, but you'll be making sure that you're feeding enough to actually hold the fish. So the XL pot is pretty much my go-to carp ground bait pot. The large is my go-to F1 pot, and then the medium is pretty much my spring pot, and the 2 small pots are pretty much my winter pots. And then if you stick to that as a general guide, a general rule, you'll not go far wrong. Now, if ground bait alone is not enough to hold the fish, it's great for drawing the fish in, but it's not enough to hold the fish because the fish are really hungry and they want to feed more, you can then start looking at ratios of 50-50 ground bait and micros. So you've got some food content in there, you've got some attraction from the ground bait, and that will hold the fish for even longer because they've actually got something to eat. So don't be scared of mixing your ground bait and your micro pellets together to try and come up with a concoction where you're holding the fish but you're also attracting them with the actual loose ground bait and the cloud going through. In terms of hook baits, ground bait, you can fish pretty much anything you want over it. There's always something that works slightly better, and that's why I'm showing you the green bagger mix today, because for me, when I'm fishing with dead reds, I always find this slightly green tinged ground bait to be really, really effective. If you put red over the top of that green, it stands out like a sore thumb. But when I'm fishing with expanders, it doesn't seem to have the same effect. So the natural colour brown ground bait seems to be better. If I was fishing with, say, a big worm, it seems to work over any colour because the size of the hook bait is really big and stands out. Again, sweet corn with a green ground bait, you put yellow over green, again, it really, the contrast is like, boom, sticks out really, really bright and vibrant. And I find that works really well. So like this new green bagger mix, it's something I wanted in the range because I think colour wise, it's absolutely perfect. It's no different from normal bagger mix, but there will be times when I might use a brown mix and people might question and say, well, I thought you loved the green mix, but it depends on the hook baits I'm fishing for and the fish I'm fishing for. If I'm fishing for F1s in the summer months and I'm fishing with micros and ground bait and I want to fish a 4mm expander on the hook, I'll probably go for a natural brown colour bagger mix. If I'm fishing with dead reds, sweet corn, I feel like the green would work slightly better. So when you come into actual, you know, picking the colour of your ground bait, colour makes a massive difference. I've experimented over the years. I've fished with red expanders, yellow expanders, normal expanders, and I always find a normal coloured expander is the best, most successful hook bait. So that's why I'll tend to stick to a brown ground bait. But if I'm fishing with dead reds, worm, corn, anything like that, if the water's got that green algae tinge to it, sometimes fishing with the green one in the height of summer is even better. Even going into the slightly colder months when the water starts to drop out of touch, it's just a little bit darker. But if you've got coloured water and it's real brown chocolate, depends on the bottom of the lake. You know, if the bottom's, what you tend to find is the bottom's quite peaty, it tends to be black. If it's clay, it tends to be more brown. And if it's got a little algae bloom, it tends to go that little bit greener. So there's a situation, and that's why we have a variety of different colours in the range, because it gives you options. So think about your hook baits, think about your volumes of baits, and hopefully that little user guide there will give you an idea now when you're coming to picking your pellets and ground bait, what you're going to actually use, why you're actually using them, whether it's because you want the potency, whether it's because you want the slightly milder ground bait. I know it can be very confusing for some people. You know, you've got all these ground baits on the shelf and your head gets blown, you're thinking, wow, I don't know what to use, but hopefully that little guide will help you put a few more fish next time you're on the bank.